The moment the Brigadier-General saw the coin in my palm, he stopped mid-sentence. The hall around us, packed with dress uniforms and pressed lapels and the quiet solemnity of Remembrance Day, seemed to compress into a single point of stillness. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for it. He just stared at it the way you stare at something you were certain no longer existed. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I almost laughed. It was a coin. Old, heavy, smaller than a loonie, with a marking on one side I'd never been able to identify. I'd found it in my grandfather's bedside drawer 3 weeks after he died. I'd been carrying it ever since, the way you carry something that belongs to someone you miss before you've fully understood you've lost them. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away in September." The Brigadier-General's jaw tightened. He looked up at me for the first time. Really looked, not at the coin but at my face, as if he was calculating something. "What was his name?" he asked quietly. "Robert MacLeod," I said. And then his expression did something I wasn't prepared for. It didn't collapse. It didn't go soft with grief. It went somewhere more complicated than that. Recognition, and something that looked a great deal like guilt. "We need to speak," he said. "Not here." That was the moment I realized my grandfather, the man my own family had let die in a hospital room in Truro without a single person from his bloodline beside him, might not have been the person any of us thought he was. My grandfather Robert lived in a small white house on the edge of a rural county in Nova Scotia, the kind of town where the Tim Hortons closes at 9, and everyone knows which families have been there for 4 generations. The house had a wood stove in the kitchen, a vegetable garden that fought with the rock every spring, and a yellow lab named Porter who outlived him by 2 years. He drove a 2003 Silverado with 190,000 kilometers on it, and never once complained about the rust. He paid his bills on time. He kept to himself. He didn't own a smartphone until I bought him one for his 73rd birthday, and even then he only used it to look up weather and call me. My parents lived 4 hours away in Dartmouth. They visited maybe twice a year, always at Christmas and usually on one August weekend when the drive felt manageable. They weren't cruel to him. They weren't cold exactly. They just treated him the way you treat a room in your house that you've stopped using, not neglected, not forgotten, just no longer part of the daily geography of your life. He didn't make demands. He didn't ask for help. He didn't show up to family events with grievances or long stories or expectations. In my parents' world, that made him low maintenance. In mine, it made him lonely, in a way that had gone on so long he'd stopped noticing it as a category of suffering. He was a veteran. I knew that. It was printed on his discharge papers, which I found years later folded into a manila envelope at the back of a filing cabinet. He'd served in the Canadian Forces for over 2 decades. Beyond that, there was almost nothing. No photographs in uniform. No regiment plaques on the wall. No stories about deployments. When I was young, I used to ask him about it the way children ask about anything that carries the particular gravity of the unspoken, and he'd always do the same thing. He'd smile at me with his eyes, nod his mouth, and say, "There's not much to tell, sweetheart." Then he'd hand me a Tim's cup and ask what I was reading. I was teaching at an elementary school in Halifax when my father called to tell me that grandfather had been taken to hospital. He'd collapsed in the kitchen. A neighbor had found him. My parents had been notified, and they were, my father said, going to try to get up there in the next few days. Next few days. I left Halifax that same afternoon. By the time I got to the hospital in Truro, he was already past the point where good news was a reasonable thing to hope for. He was awake when I walked in, but just barely, the kind of awake that lives at the edge of somewhere else. His hands looked smaller than I remembered. The room smelled like recycled air and the particular silence of machines doing the work a body has stopped doing for itself. He opened his eyes when I sat down beside him. "You didn't have to come," he said. His voice was raspy and thin, but his eyes were the same as they'd always been. Still and very present. "I know," I said. "Your parents coming?" I didn't answer right away. He read my pause the way he read everything, without drama, without accusation. "That's all right," he said, and he meant it. That was the part I couldn't stand. He genuinely meant it. He died 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, with me on one side of the bed and a nurse named Beverly on the other. It was quiet. It was gentler than I'd feared. But nothing about it was small. When I called my mother to tell her, she went silent for a moment. Then she said, "Oh, sweetheart. Are you okay?" Not, "Why didn't we come?" Not, We should have been there. Just, are you okay? As if the weight of what had happened was mine alone to carry, and they were standing safely at a distance from it. My brother sent a text. He was sorry, he said. It had been a busy stretch at work. I arranged the funeral myself. It was held on a Friday, a week after he died, at a small United church in his county that smelled like old hymnals and radiator heat. 11 people attended. 3 of them were neighbors. One was a woman from the Legion branch in town who said she'd seen him at coffee mornings over the years. One was a retired man who shook my hand and said only that he'd known my grandfather a long time ago, and that he was sorry for my loss, and then stood at the back of the room for the duration without speaking to anyone else. My parents arrived 20 minutes late and left 30 minutes after the service ended. My brother didn't come at all. I stood at the grave in November cold and listened to the minister speak the old words, and felt something settle into my chest that I still haven't fully named. It wasn't anger yet. Anger came later. What I felt then was quieter and heavier, and somehow more permanent. Afterward, I went back to the house to begin sorting through his things. Most of it was what you'd expect: old tools, winter clothing in good condition, a shelf of military history books with their spines intact because he'd read them carefully. In the kitchen there were 3 tins of Maxwell House and a drawer full of takeout menus from a Chinese restaurant that had closed in 2019. In the living room, a La-Z-Boy that had molded itself exactly to the shape of him. In his bedroom, on the nightstand, underneath a library book about the birds of Atlantic Canada, I found the coin. It was smaller than I'd expected, heavy for its size, solid metal, the surface worn smooth on one side from years of handling. On the other side there was a symbol, not a maple leaf, not a regimental crest, not anything I recognized from any badge or flag or insignia I'd seen before. It looked almost like a compass rose, but asymmetric, with one of the cardinal points replaced by a small line that could have been a number or a letter, depending on the light. There was no text, no date, no name. I thought of my grandfather carrying this in his pocket every day the way other men carry worry stones. I thought of him turning it over in his fingers the way I was turning it over in mine. I kept it. I didn't know what else to do with it. My parents didn't ask about it. They didn't ask about much of anything. By the time I drove back through Truro 3 weeks later, they had already arranged to have the house sold. The estate sale had cleared out most of the furniture. The vegetable garden was going dormant under the first frost. The whole thing had been resolved with a speed that made me feel faintly sick, like watching someone erase a sentence before you'd finished reading it. I went back to Halifax, back to my classroom, my routines, the particular discipline of showing up every day and being useful to other people's children. I carried the coin on my keychain, next to my car keys and my school lanyard, because it felt wrong to leave it in a drawer. November came. Remembrance Day came with it. I had been invited to attend a ceremony at a Legion Hall in Dartmouth, a formal commemoration for Canadian Forces veterans, the kind of event that fills a room with dress uniforms and service medals, and the particular quality of silence that only exists between the last post and reveille. I went in a dark blazer and good shoes. I wore the coin on a short chain around my neck because I'd done it once before and it had felt right, the way wearing someone's watch feels right after they're gone. The hall was full. Older veterans in Legion blazers with rows of medals, retired officers in civilian suits, families with children who stood up straighter than they usually did because the room required it. I shook hands, made quiet conversation, stood through the ceremony with my hands folded and thought about my grandfather standing alone in a house 3 hours away, watching Remembrance Day coverage on a television with the sound turned low because the neighbors could hear through the walls. That was when I saw the Brigadier-General. He was standing near the far end of the hall, speaking with a small group of men, all of them well past retirement age, all of them carrying themselves with the kind of posture that doesn't leave you even when the uniform does. He was tall, gray-haired, with the specific composure of someone who had spent decades making difficult things look ordinary. I wasn't planning to approach him. I was on my way to the table with the coffee urns when our paths crossed near the entrance to the side room. He glanced at me as people do in crowded halls, a brief recognition that you are a person and not a piece of furniture. And then his eyes went to the coin at my throat, and everything in him stopped. Not a flinch, not a double take, a genuine physical stopping, like a film frame held too long. He turned toward me slowly. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was measured and quiet and completely controlled, which somehow made it more unsettling. I turned to face him. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "My grandfather left it to me," I said. He passed away in September. He looked at the coin for a moment longer without speaking. Then he looked at me. What was his name? When I told him, something moved across his face that was too quick to catch fully. He composed himself in the span of a breath. I'd like to speak with you, he said. Privately, if you're willing. I followed him into a small side room off the main hall. 2 chairs, a small table, a window facing the parking lot. The sounds of the ceremony continued through the wall in muffled fragments, applause and voices and the clink of teacups. He sat down across from me. He didn't speak right away. He looked at the coin once more, then at my face. Your grandfather never discussed his service with you, he said. It wasn't a question. No, I said. I knew he'd served. I didn't know much else. He nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. There are units within the Canadian Forces, he began, that don't appear in public-facing records. They operate under mandates that require what's called plausible deniability. The work they do, if it becomes public, could compromise ongoing operations, living assets, and in some cases the safety of civilians in other countries. I knew about JTF-2 the way most Canadians know about it vaguely, from headlines, as an abstract fact. A special operations unit, very secretive, not often discussed. Your grandfather was part of a predecessor structure, he continued, before JTF-2 was formally established. A unit that ran from the early 1970s through the late 1980s. Reconnaissance and intelligence extraction, primarily in Eastern Europe and parts of Southeast Asia. The kind of work that, if it succeeded, officially never happened. I stared at him. So he was a spy, I said. The word felt strange in my mouth, too cinematic for the man who had driven a rusted Silverado and grown tomatoes. The word we'd use is operative, he said. But yes, in the simplest terms. And that coin? He looked at it again. It's a verification marker, he said. Not a medal, not a commendation. Internal identification used within that unit to authenticate individuals cleared for operations above a certain classification. Most of them were recalled and destroyed when the unit was formally dissolved. The fact that he kept his as he paused. It's significant. I thought about my grandfather's hands. The way he'd always kept them busy, fixing things, turning things over, never quite still. My family treated him like he'd wasted his life, I said. The words came out flat and precise. My parents didn't come when he was dying. They weren't at the funeral. They sold his house inside of a month. The Brigadier-General's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. That is a common cost of that kind of service, he said quietly. When you cannot speak about what you've done, the people around you fill the silence with their own assumptions. And the assumptions are almost always wrong. He asked me to contact his office. He gave me a card. He said there were things I should know, things that had recently been partially declassified, and that I deserved to hear them. Then he stood, shook my hand, and returned to the ceremony. I sat in that small room for a few minutes after he left, holding the coin in my palm. The ceremony continued on the other side of the wall. A bugler was playing something that vibrated faintly in the drywall. On the drive home, I called my mother. Did you know grandfather did special operations? I said. She laughed, not unkindly, but dismissively. He was in the military, yes. I mean classified operations. Covert work. A Brigadier-General just recognized one of his personal effects at a Remembrance Day ceremony. Oh, sweetheart, that tone she had, patient and slightly tired. Your grandfather liked to suggest he was important. He always had. You know how he was. I did know how he was. He was a man who never once suggested anything of the kind. My father was worse. When I brought it up the next evening, he sighed audibly and said that my grandfather had always created an air of mystery around himself and that it had been exhausting to be around. He made everyone feel like they were being tested, he said, like there was always some deeper meaning he wasn't sharing. It wasn't depth, it was just distance. I thought about all the Christmases grandfather had sat at the end of the table and listened while my father talked about his contracting business and my mother talked about her book club and my brother talked about his mortgage. I thought about how my grandfather would ask each of them questions, genuine questions, the kind that required you to think before you answered, and how they would answer briefly and then redirect toward someone else, as if his interest in them was somehow an imposition. I had driven up to see him 3 or 4 times a year. We'd sit on his back porch when the weather allowed, or at his kitchen table when it didn't, and he'd make instant coffee that was too strong, and we'd talk about whatever was in front of us. He never pushed. He never complained about being forgotten. He just seemed relieved. Relieved when I was there, relieved not to be alone for a few hours. I hadn't understood then what I was relieving him of. I met with the Brigadier-General 2 weeks later at a small office building near CFB Halifax, not a base. Just a quiet, government-adjacent space with a small flag out front and a reception desk staffed by a woman who seemed to expect me. He was already in the back room. With him were 2 other men, both older, both in civilian clothes, both carrying themselves with the quiet density of people who had once worn uniforms and never quite stopped. He placed a thin folder on the table. "I can only show you what has been fully declassified," he said. "But it's enough." Inside were 4 pages. Heavy redaction throughout, most names and locations blacked out, but enough remained. Operations in Poland and Czechoslovakia in the mid-1970s, intelligence extraction, safe passage for individuals whose identities were being sought by state security services. A series of entries in 1981 that referred only to a primary field operative in terms that made it clear this person had been responsible for the successful exfiltration of 3 intelligence assets whose exposure would have Sothers resulted in their deaths. My grandfather's name appeared once, in a single sentence that had been declassified as part of a broader archive review. Operative MacLeod confirmed asset security. No further contact required. "He saved people," I said. "Multiple times over the course of a decade," the Brigadier-General said. "People who are still alive today because of decisions he made under circumstances that most people would not have survived. And he was never recognized for any of it. Recognizing him would have required acknowledging what he did," he said. "Which would have required acknowledging that it happened. Which, officially, it didn't." I looked at the pages for a long time. I thought about my grandfather watching Remembrance Day on television every November 11th in a house that smelled like wood smoke, alone. "He knew this would always be the case," I said. "Yes," the Brigadier-General said. "He understood the terms when he agreed to them. Did he regret them?" The Brigadier-General was quiet for a moment. "I knew him briefly," he said finally. "We overlapped for about 8 months in the mid-80s. He was winding down and I was just beginning. He didn't speak about regret. He paused. He said once that the hardest part was not the secrecy itself. The hardest part was that secrecy looks, from the outside, exactly like having nothing to say. That night, I went back to the small box of my grandfather's things I had kept from the estate. His discharge papers, 3 photographs, none of them in uniform. A letter, handwritten on plain white paper, folded once and left unsealed inside the lining of a winter jacket I'd almost donated to Value Village. I hadn't seen it before. I sat on my apartment floor and read it under the kitchen light. "If you're reading this, you found the coin. That means you're the only one who looked. There are things about my life I was never able to explain to anyone. Not your parents, not anyone in the family. That was the agreement I made a long time ago, and I don't regret making it. I want you to know that. If you ever meet someone who recognizes that coin and asks where it came from, tell them the truth. Tell them it was mine. Tell them I trusted you with it. That will be enough. You were always the one who sat with me. I hope you know what that meant." I sat there for a long time on the floor of my apartment. I drove to my parents' house in Dartmouth the following weekend. My father was in the living room watching a hockey game. My mother was in the kitchen. My brother had come down from Moncton for reasons that had nothing to do with me, which made the timing feel almost deliberate. I placed the letter on the coffee table. I placed the photocopied pages from the Brigadier-General's folder beside it. "I need you to read these," I said. My father read the letter first, then the pages. He read the letter again. By the time he set it down, his hands were not steady. "This isn't how did he?" He stopped. He tried again. "This can't be the same person." "It is," I said. My mother read them in the kitchen, standing at the counter. I watched her read the line about the operative confirming asset security. I watched her face do something complicated. "He never said a word," she said finally. Not accusatory, just quiet. Bewildered almost. "He couldn't," I said. "But even before when we were young and he was still active, he never—" "That was the whole point," I said. My brother was the one who finally said the thing nobody else had reached yet. He was sitting on the arm of the couch, looking at the floor. "I called him once," he said. "A few years ago." He sounded tired. "He said it would be good to see me sometime, and I said yeah, absolutely. And then I just didn't. He stopped. I told myself he was fine. That he liked being on his own. That he had his routines. He did like being on his own, I said. But that's different from having no choice. Nobody said anything for a while. The hockey game was still on with the volume low. Outside it was raining, the particular gray November rain that doesn't commit to stopping. We let him die alone, my father said. He wasn't asking a question or looking for a rebuttal. He was just saying it, placing it in the room, in the plain declarative that felt, somehow, more honest than anything we'd managed in years. We let him die alone and we sold his house and we just moved on. Yes, I said. You did. My mother covered her face with her hands. My brother was very still. I told them about the second service. A proper one, not to replace the first, but to do the thing the first one hadn't managed, which was to have the people who should have been there actually be there. We held it the following month, on a Saturday, at the Legion Hall in his county. We invited the neighbors who had checked on him over the years. We invited the woman from his coffee morning. We invited the man who had stood at the back of the church and said almost nothing, who turned out to have been a former colleague who still couldn't speak about specifics but had wanted to be present. The Brigadier-General came as well, quietly, standing near the door without medals or ceremony. My mother brought photographs she had found in a box in their own storage pictures from when my grandfather was young, before whatever he had chosen to become had required him to become invisible. In one of them he was laughing, genuinely laughing, at something outside the frame. He looked like a person who could have been happy, who maybe had been. My father spoke. It was not a polished speech. He stood at the front of the room with his hands in his pockets and said that he had spent most of his life evaluating people by what they showed him and that he had therefore managed to completely miss the person standing closest to him. He said that was a failure of imagination and of character, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life understanding why it happened, so that it didn't happen to anyone else in his life. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. My brother placed a folded flag beside the simple headstone we'd commissioned to replace the temporary marker. On it was my grandfather's name, his birth year, his death year, and nothing else. No rank, no unit, no explanation. Just the facts of his having existed, which were, as it turned out, not small at all. I stood at the grave with the coin in my closed hand and thought about everything it had taken to arrive at this moment. The loneliness my grandfather had carried for decades without ever asking anyone to carry it with him. The silence my family had interpreted as absence, when it had actually been its opposite. The particular invisibility of people who do not advertise what they carry. My parents changed after that. Not all at once, not completely, not in any way that erased what had already happened, but they changed. My father started going to the Legion on his own, not for the ceremony but for the coffee, for the chance to sit with men who had similar pockets of unspoken experience and to just be in the same room with them. My mother began asking questions about things she had previously dismissed, about his deployments, about the countries he'd been to, about the years we'd all accepted as vague and therefore unimportant. She called me one evening, about 3 months after the second service, and said, "I keep thinking about that line in his letter, about sitting with him. I didn't do that enough." "No," I said. "But you know now. Is that enough?" "I think it has to be," I said. "It doesn't resolve neatly. Grief compounded by guilt. You can't go back and sit with someone. You can't return the hours you didn't spend, the calls you didn't make, the drive you decided was too long on too many successive weekends. What you can do is hold those things honestly, without softening them, and let them change the way you move through whatever time is left. I still have the coin. I wear it sometimes and leave it in a small dish on my dresser other times, but I always know where it is. A few months ago, a colleague at my school noticed it and asked what it was. I told her it was my grandfather's. She asked what he did. I told her as much as I was able to, which wasn't much, which was, in a strange way, the most accurate thing I could have said. The Brigadier-General retired in the spring. He sent me a short letter. In it, he said that my grandfather had once told him the work they did was justified not by recognition but by outcome, and that he had held on to that belief for 40 years. He said he hoped I understood what I was in possession of, not a secret, not a mystery, but proof that quiet service is still service, and that the lives it saves don't know whose hands made them possible. I drove out to the cemetery on a Sunday morning in June. The trees along the road were fully green by then, the way Nova Scotia becomes in early summer, almost aggressively alive after the long gray winter. I parked and walked to the headstone and knelt down and stayed for a while without speaking, because silence had been his language and I was finally learning it. I thought about all the things I hadn't known to ask when I'd had the chance. All the conversations we'd had about weather and books and school and the lab named Porter, which were good conversations, real ones, and which I don't regret. But also all the conversations we'd never had, because I hadn't known there was something to ask, and because he would never have volunteered it. I placed the coin at the base of the stone for a moment, let it rest there in the grass. I thought about what it means to live quietly and do real things and leave behind almost nothing for anyone to find. I thought about how the world tends to celebrate the loudest version of a story, the medal, the parade, the acknowledgement, and how the truest versions are often the ones nobody hears until much later, if at all. My grandfather never asked to be found out. He never wrote the letter expecting it to change anything. He wrote it the way you leave a light on for someone, not because you're certain they're coming, but because you want them to be able to find the door if they do. I picked the coin back up. Warm from the sun, I still wear it. Not because of what it proves, not because of what it signifies to anyone who recognizes it, but because of what it reminds me of every time I look down and see it. That the person beside you at the dinner table, the one who asks questions and listens carefully, and never takes up too much space, that person may be carrying something enormous that has no visible seam. That quiet is not the same as empty, that the life that doesn't announce itself is still a life. My family sits differently at the table now. My father asks more questions. My brother calls my grandfather's old neighbors at Christmas. My mother lit a candle on his birthday for the first time this year, and left it burning through the whole evening. We are not healed. We are something more honest than healed. We are people who know what we lost, and are trying to carry it accurately. And if you have listened to this, and felt something stir, if there is someone in your own life who sits quietly at the edge of the room and helps without announcing it, and never quite fits the measurements your family uses for success, please go and sit with them. Ask them a question that takes longer than one sentence to answer. Give them the conversation you might otherwise decide to have later. Later has a way of becoming never. My grandfather understood that. He just chose not to say so. He left the coin instead. And it was enough to find the way back to him.